The ones these boxed actually refers to non-Muslims, right? So some of these, as crusaders, they ruled over Muslim world. So there were two major attacks: the attack of crusaders who came from the west, and the Mongols who came in the 13th century of Common Era from the northwest. Islamic history of this period is amazingly stable when it comes to societies, in the sense that people continue to live in the same ways, in same institutions. You know, there were the ulama, there were the sufis, and people had similar practices and traditions, but they're very unstable politically. So you will see that there were crusaders, and all kinds of people are changing hands. Dynasties are coming and going. There were the Seljuks, and then the Ayyubids and Mamluks. When it comes to Syria and Egypt, in Iran you have the Seljuks, and then you had the Mongols, and then you have many other dynasties here. So politics and society are separated, and one of the consequences of that is that rulers are coming and going all the time, but that does not change how essentially the society is working. This is very different from our modern times, when modern government, the state, the nation state, which is really a creation of European history, a new kind of government, a new kind of government that owns and interferes with all aspects of life. That did not exist in the pre-modern Islamic history, right? Pre-modern Islamic history, societies are far more powerful and far more stable. Powerful in the sense that they are not being interfered by the rulers, by political invaders. In fact, if you look at the history of the Mongols, who came in 1258, they took Baghdad, and eastern half of the Islamic world came under the rule of the Mongols, non-Muslims. But within 50 years, all of them converted to Islam. And that was a demonstration of the power of Islamic societies. That even though Muslim societies were not able politically, militarily to defend themselves, but they were powerful enough to assimilate such a large, grand a wave of invaders that had conquered the rest of the world. You know, these people started from Mongolia and went like a wave all over Asia and all over Europe, and created for a short time the largest empire that existed at the time. But quickly, Islamic society ate them up, so that these guys became Muslim within a period of 50 years. So this tells you something about the weakness and the strength of Muslim societies. The weakness was political unity, and political relationship between the rulers and the ruled was quite weak. Rulers were not elected. Rulers did not sometimes interact with or speak even the same language as the ruled. And that at times they could be, and that they were changing hands, and they would fight each other according to rules that had nothing to do with Islam. And they did not have interest. You see, one of the things that happens when people are interested in only their societies and their communities is that they don't undertake long-term, big, wide, nationwide projects, because that can only happen when you have a successful political rule that is legitimate and that cares about people and so on. That did not exist. So there were no long-term, big, ambitious projects to transform anything. People were just living happily, and intellectually this was a very vibrant life. Intellectually, this was a kind of life that ulama had all kinds of different opinions. They were writing all kinds of sciences. And one of the most beautiful things about this world was that if you went to any of the major Muslim cities, Cairo or Damascus, you would find that 50 to 70% of the prime real estate, prime land, was given to charity and was run by hospitals and run as hospitals or madrasas rather than high-rise capitalist businesses, right? So if Manhattan was an Islamic city, right in the middle of the city, the big high-rises would be hospitals and universities that are free for all. 50 to 70%, according to the statistics we have of the cities, Muslim cities, 50 to 70% of prime real estate was given by the people as waqf or endowments. Waqf for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning a rich person died and said, take my land and establish a madrasa there, or take my land or establish a hospital there, or take my land, establish something for a sanctuary for animals there. You know, there are all kinds of different projects. But what's interesting is that this was not a capitalist world, even though there was free market. Free market, but no capitalism. People lived for different purposes and under different rules so people's lives in some ways were far more merciful. People lived under systems that was much greater sense of flourishing than modern people, even those living in Beverly Hills, California, can imagine. Because they were spiritually as well as intellectually flourishing. What you did not have, however, was political legitimacy. What you did not have was the ability to defend against invaders. And if those invaders were strong and organized, they could take over all of this and create havoc. Right? So there was a trade-off. The kind of societies Muslims created were politically weak, socially very strong. Yes?
How was the political administration funding itself? Because you mentioned like
taxes. So there were taxes.
Taxes on even Muslim subjects.
Taxes on, zakat was part of the taxes on some of the people, especially during, typically a Muslim dynasty would fund itself in a number of ways. Most importantly, there are some lands that were reserved for the rulers, right? And then there were no taxes per se, but during times of war, they could go collect taxes, and the ulama usually opposed taxation outside of zakat. And zakat really didn't count for much, and it went to the poor and so on. And then taxes on non-Muslims, right? So that was one of the sources of revenue. So these were, and then taxes on Muslims if they had lands. For agrarian lands, there were some taxes. But the amount of taxes, according to a recent scholarly analysis, the amount of taxes was about, at most, would be something like 5%. As opposed to, of course, 30-40% of the taxes that we today think about. So taxes were very low, yes?
Why were the scholars opposed?
The scholars say that rulers has no right to impose any taxes other than zakat. They were called mukus, and mukus was considered illegitimate. There were some scholars like Ibn Taymiyya who said that the ruler has a right to collect taxes under certain conditions and so on and so forth. But the point that it wasn't an easy thing to do for the rulers to do. The ulama would not, because money is power. And the ulama did not want rulers to mess around with that. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to now go back to some of this that we have talked about. All right, so let's go back to our slides. I have given you the big picture of those 800 years that are to come. I won't have time to go through them century by century in detail, so I'm going to go really quickly, because then I want to get to, in the last hour, this is our last hour, I want to get to the modern period after the Ottoman Empire, okay? This is, by the way, the S-curve of early Middle East conversion to Islam that I talked about earlier, that most people seem to have converted in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Right? And then the total number of converts remained at about 80% until present day period. And what this S-curve shows, according to scholars, is that most people converted according to what is called a knowledge curve. That means people, S-curve shows when something is spreading by word of mouth and by interaction. Whereas if Muslims had converted by force, this would look something like this. Here, and then all the way here, and then that, right? But you don't have that kink over there. Rather, what you have an S-curve that shows that it was really convergence were a natural process. And this is a more detailed account of when people began to convert. So in the Abbasid period, and then during this period, you begin to see more conversions. All right. All right. I already talked about the Sunni revival in the 5th century. The only thing that I haven't talked about is Imam Ghazali. So let me just talk about that. To pick up some of the other earlier discussions we had about Sufism and madhabs, right? So Imam Al-Ghazali died in the year 505. That means the beginning of 6th century. That is flourished in the 5th century of Islam. He is, if you will, the most celebrated intellectual of the classical period. Why is he so celebrated? Well, he was a brilliant writer and a brilliant thinker, and he knew how to write so well, and he collected and brought together a lot of concerns of the period. He's especially known for the crisis of faith that he had towards the middle of his life. And his crisis of faith was about what he found, that he was learning these legal sciences and he was learning kalam. But this was, his legal sciences and his kalam were not giving him deep transformation. So he went and learned falsafa, that is, as we saw, that they were Hellenistic or Greek-inspired philosophers, especially Ibn Sina, who was a major philosopher and who was also a big challenge for Ghazali and other Sunnis to try to find an answer to Ibn Sina. But none of this falsafa and kalam, none of this, Ghazali said, gave him certainty of faith. What he was after was certitude of faith. He wanted to have absolute faith in the doctrines that he preached. And he found that he was internally empty. Right? In fact, he writes about how he was an arrogant man who looked down upon people. When he was very young, he excelled in everything. So he began to look down upon other people. And then he realized what he was and how empty he was. So he left for 10 years. And during these years, he came in encounter with Sufism. And there he converted to Sufism and began to write about Sufism as a solution to the problem of faith. So for the first, usually the credit of introducing Sufism to respectable sciences of Sharia is given to Ghazali, even though other people had done this before him, but he did it so eloquently and so powerfully that for many of the scholars, Sufism became a science of Sharia, even though he also condemned many of the Sufis who were what he called charlatans, or who didn't know what they were talking about. So many of the Sufi tariqas, many of the popular Sufis. Another thing is that by the time when Ghazali is writing, you don't really have tariqa Sufism. Like tariqas don't really exist at this time. But Sufism is an elite practice. That is, a few individuals are doing it. After Ghazali, in the century afterwards, Sufism becomes a mass religious phenomenon. It becomes popular. It's probably not because of Ghazali, but because of other reasons. But Ghazali played an important role in bringing Sufism and Sharia together. Okay.
So is he known as mujaddid for that century? Or?
Well, that's the difficult thing to say because part of, but thank you for the question. It's an excellent question given that we're talking about Tajdeed and revival. By the Ash'ara or by the pro-Kalam people, he is seen as the mujaddid of that century. But people who don't like Kalam, they find that many of his writings are quite problematic. That he cannot be seen as, the mujaddid or the perfect scholar. So because Muslim Sunnis now begin to disagree, and remember there was the idea that there is one mujaddid for every century is also a problematic idea because the hadith doesn't say one mujaddid, right? So you can see him certainly one major figure, one major reformer, but at the same time people find problems with his works as well. So for example, in Ihya Ulumuddin, the scholars of hadith say that more than 60% of the hadith that he used are weak or fabricated because he was not a scholar of hadith. In fact, he was terrible at hadith. So he usually cites hadith that are fabricated to make points that are quite big, right? So that becomes, at the same time, he's such a great writer and he's such a master of theological sciences and usul al-fiqh that you can't ignore him either, right? So nobody really ignores him completely, but there are people who are like completely pro-Ghazali, there is nothing like Ghazali, and then others who are like, well, there's good and bad.
Who did the Ahl hadith say? Did they come up with someone else in their opinion?
Well, yes, there were many. Ahl hadith, for example, Ibn al-Jawzi is somebody who wrote another version of Ihya Ulumuddin, which is called Minhaj al-Qasidin, in which he removed the weak hadith, which is essentially he took from Ghazali, and this is a very typical Islamic response. If somebody did something wrong, well, you take from them what's good, and you fix it up, right? So everybody accepted Ghazali in one way or another, but they critiqued various aspects of it. And it wasn't only Ahl al-Hadith. So for example, Turtushi was a great Maliki scholar and himself an Ash'ari. They had, in North Africa, they had Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin burned in public. Because Ihya Ulumuddin applied that the ulama had gone astray. Right? And the fact was, if you actually look at history, Ghazali was making a rhetorical point. It was made more his story rather than everybody's story. There were plenty of pious ulama who did not need Sufism to make them pious. And there were plenty of ulama who were absolutely sure of God. They didn't need Sufism to make them sure. So it was in some way, like all intellectuals, he was telling his story as if it's a story of everyone. And so some people were very offended by that. And that's not necessarily just because they were. And of course the Falasifa, people like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, he wrote a refutation of Imam Al-Ghazali in his Tahafut al-Tahafut, right? That he said the Ghazali is simply confused. He is, halfway in falsafa, halfway in this and that. He's confused. So there were many critics as well. When you are popular, when you're so influential, you got critics. Yes?
When you say he is so-and-so Ash'ari, Ash'ari literally means is the school of thought or what?
Yes, Ash'arism is it means the pro-Kalam Sunnis who follow the tradition of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari was a scholar that we talked about earlier, right? So among the Sunnis, then there were three theological schools: the Salafi school or the Ahl al-Hadith school, the Ash'ari school, and Maturidi school. Maturidis and Ash'aris agree on some things, and Maturidis and Ahl al-Hadith agree on some things. So there's three more or less. They overlap on some things and disagree on others. Now, of course, we usually know about madhabs, legal madhabs, like Hanafis and Shafi'is. We usually don't talk about theological madhabs. But they also, they had theological madhabs were more a matter of intellectuals. Ordinary people did not really need to concern themselves, whereas ordinary people would need to know, if I have this problem, if I'm making wudu and this happened, that happened, I have to go ask a scholar what to do. So legal madhabs of fiqh were of a matter of daily concern for ordinary people, whereas theology is like, what does it mean that God sat on the throne? Yeah.
So you have these Ahlul Hadith who's actually trying to correct a lot of the works of Prophet, like example of Ibn al-Jawzi doing the correction of Taymiyya, right? Do you have similar works from the pro-Kalam people who are actually trying to bring the good aspects of Sufism into the people of Ahlul Hadith?
Yes, I mean there are all kinds of works. Ibn al-Jawzi himself was a mix between Ash'aris and Hanbalis. So his theology was very Ash'ari, but he was also a muhaddith and so on. So there are all kinds of mix and match. Well, Ibn Taymiyya is a different phenomenon. Ibn Taymiyya is he's a response to Ghazali by Ahl al-Hadith or by the Salafi tradition. But he's somebody who has read and absorbed the sciences of Kalam and Mu'tazila and Ash'aris and Falasifa and early Hadith and early history in a way that very, very few people did. So his knowledge of history and knowledge of all of these sects was just unsurpassed. And so that's why he was able to, so he had a very different kind of project that I'll talk about when we get there.
What's the difference between Salafi and Sufi? Same thing?
I wish, but no. So Salafi means people who follow, and actually I'm going to get to it later, right? So let me actually wait till the last slide before I talk about it. Yes?
So even though, like you were saying, it was mostly for the intellectuals, like the thought that they came with, it did in many ways affect the common masses also.
Kalam, you mean?
Yes, kalam.
So, kalam or theological discussions, did that affect ordinary people? Yes, absolutely. But in very indirect ways. Anyway, so let me move on to talk about the 6th century. There's some interesting developments. I'm going to only take tidbits, right? So 6th century, the madhabs in the 6th century after Imam Al-Ghazali, the madhabs are becoming more and more consolidated, and people are becoming, for the lack of a better word, more and more fanatic about the madhab that they belong to. A symptom of the problem that I was talking about, that when your society is strong but politics is weak, is that when the Crusaders came, they came from the Latin West all the way through what is Turkey today to Syria, various cities of Syria, conquering those cities, all the way to Jerusalem, into the heart of the Muslim world, and not one single Muslim army went out, united people, and meet them. In other words, the princes, the Muslims at that time were ruled by Seljuk princes who were each other's enemies more than they were, if you will, leaders of Islam, and they did not really care much. So the cities of Aleppo and Antioch and others were taken and massacred by the Crusaders, who were a bunch of hooligans, by the way. The Crusaders were not really a professional army. They were just a very large army that surprised everybody. But such a disorganized army it was able to take and come to the heart of the Muslim world and take a city without really being seriously interrupted. So that was a symptom of what happens when you forget about the collective welfare. Right? So there were many good parts of the society, but there was also this almost tragic aspect that it took 80 years for Muslims to come together and put together a response to the Crusaders. And when Crusaders came, I mean, the stories of what they had done, I mean, they just massacred people, and including some local Christians and Jews and whatnot. I mean, they were just, and sometimes you have stories of these folks, they were hungry and savage, so they actually killed children and according to some ate them, like they were just out of but Muslims did not respond for a very long time. So Nuruddin Zangi, who started, if you will, renewed jihad, Nuruddin Zangi, and then after him his general Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, they were able to put together an army and unite the Fatimids. One of the things they needed to do before they could take on the Crusaders was to unite Syria and Egypt, because Egypt had the money and Syria had the army, and so they had to defeat the Fatimids first. So Salahuddin Ayyubi went and led the army of Nuruddin, and then Nuruddin died, so Salahuddin became the Amir, and then he was able to unite Syria and Egypt and then defeat the Crusaders. And Crusaders kept coming in waves every 30, 40 years. And so that remained a problem for Muslims. But on the whole, the effect of Crusaders on Muslims was not that great, other than the fact, in other words, Muslim mode of government didn't really change very much. The culture didn't change very much. One interesting popular if you will, a rise of if you will, popular phenomenon is Mawlid al-Nabi, alayhi salatu wassalam. The celebration of the birthday of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam starts in the Fatimid dynasty for the first time. According to the research that we have, it really starts with the 12er Shi'as celebration of Ali and the Imams, and later Sunnis pick it up, and the Fatimids pick it up. That is, Fatimids are also 7er Shia, and then Sunnis take it from there. So for the first time, you begin to have celebrations of the Prophet ﷺ. That become an important religious. So in the 5th and 6th centuries, they become important religious celebrations for Muslims. Rise also 6th century, there is rise of tariqa Sufism. Sheikh Abdul Qadir Gilani, or Abdul Qadir Jilani of Baghdad, is a great, both a scholar and a Sufi, and many of his students spread around the world, around the Muslim world, that is. And so tariqa Sufism is a very interesting phenomenon, because it really is a result in some ways of the breakdown of political order. That people belong to each other by belonging to these Sufi brotherhoods. Right? So this way, and especially tariqa Sufism serves people in far off areas that are far away from cities. Because if you're in the city, you have your established community, you follow the ulama, usually you're a Hanafi, you're a Shafi'i, you're a Maliki, or whatnot. But outside of the cities where the ulama do not have this reach, a crucial role is played by tariqa Sufism, by the Sufi tariqas, that is. Another thing that begins to happen at this time is that people don't appreciate that the map of Islam becomes quite a bit wider. That is, number of conversions. So if you look at, this is a difficult, I couldn't find a better version of this map, but you look at all of these regions over here in Central and West Africa, and Southeast Asia, and the large parts of India, and certainly Bangladesh. These people are becoming Muslims after this period. Right? So this is much, much later than the early conquest that we were talking about. So new people are coming into Islam in large numbers. And one of the things that this is doing is that these people are coming into Islam with their own customs, with their own understanding. So there is a new wave almost of mixing and matching in religion, or what we may call a lot of bid'ah, right? But a lot of bid'ah happens almost naturally because there's so many people that are coming with their own different backgrounds into Islam. So the period, expansion of Islam from, that is in the Common Era, 1250 to 1500. There's a second wave of expansion of Islam, and there are no armies involved in this at all, right? In the first case, armies are opening countries but not forcing conversion. In the second case, the armies are not involved at all. And then, of course, there is this little fall here, because this is one case when Muslims actually lose the whole region, right? In the rest of these, Islam is expanding. This is another slightly better map of the new regions that are coming into Islam. Okay? This does not include Southeast Asia, which it should, because even though it looks very tiny, the number of people there was very large. I'm just going to skip that. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Ibn Taymiyya because he is such an important figure and also such a controversial figure. So, Ibn Taymiyya died in the year 728 in the Islamic era, or 1328 in the Common Era. So what was Ibn Taymiyya trying to do? Ibn Taymiyya's basic project was to take, first, his essential problem was they were politically, Muslims seemed to have become unable to defend themselves, both against the Crusaders and the Mongols. Right, the whole eastern half of the Islamic world was chopped off. So there seemed to be a problem. One of the problems that Ibn Taymiyya recognizes is that Muslims have become too inward-looking and too communitarian. So a typical alim, a scholar, was worried about the welfare of the Hanafis. The books that are being written are about how Abu Hanifa was much smarter than Shafi'i, right? Or that how Hanafi fiqh is much more persuasive than the Shafi'i fiqh, or vice versa. So this is of course leads to great insights into the workings of law, but the purpose of this is rather intellectual, and there is very little concern with the big picture of all Muslims. There are very few people now who are talking about the Muslim Ummah, because ulama are talking about Hanafis or Sufis or Ash'aris or Ahl al-Hadith, and the rulers are talking about the Syria, Damascus is mine, that Antioch is yours, and Egypt is that guy's. So Ibn Taymiyya, this is one of his major problems, is that Muslims are disunited, and that disunity begins with the way that they're beginning to understand their deen. And remember, Ibn Taymiyya wrote this famous book, Raf'ul Malam an A'immatil A'lam, that he said all of the four great Imams, all of them were right, all of them are acceptable, all of them are great, all of them accept the basic principles of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Therefore, stop saying that this Imam is better than that Imam. That's something we take for granted now, but that was a major contribution, because that took the amount of knowledge that Ibn Taymiyya had to show that. Because remember, even Imam Al-Ghazali and Juwayni, with such great scholars, did not really think much of Abu Hanifa. They were actually very critical of him, right? So these great scholars still had a lot of other things that they still had. Similarly, Ghazali, for example, he dies in the year 1111 in the Common Era. Crusaders come and conquer the Holy Land, Jerusalem, in 1099. Imam al-Ghazali dies 12 years after that. There is not a single word in all of his writings about the Crusaders. What does that tell us? One could say that maybe he did not know about the Crusaders, which is very difficult to believe, or maybe. But the thing is that it seemed that concerns of ulama were so academic and so focused on that nobody was thinking about that there is a problem with the ummah, like something big is being threatened. So that's why, I mean, that's one thing that you find very different in Ibn Taymiyyah, who was not only a scholar but actually a mujahid, and he led the military assault against the Mongols and so on and so forth. So Ibn Taymiyyah was trying to fix all of these problems. Another thing that Ibn Taymiyyah was doing was to say that he was using the first 3 centuries of Islam and the scholars of the first 3 centuries, the Salaf, to criticize the next 3 centuries. That was his intellectual project. When it comes to either the law or kalam, law or theology, he was essentially saying, look, there was a time when Islam was a thriving force. Now you have all of these problems. You need to go back. But anyway, so he says many things that are quite, there is a lot attributed to him that he didn't say. He did not reject Sufism, by the way. It's often said, but he did not reject Sufism at all. He actually had great respect for Sufis like Al-Junayd and Al-Gilani and so on. He was himself not a Sufi, and he did not think that Sufism was the best way, but he did not reject Sufism. He considered Sufis to be seekers of truth and seekers of Allah from whom one had to learn. He believed that the Prophet and the Sahaba were the best seekers of Allah and the best lovers of Allah, and one did not need to be a Sufi in order to follow them. In fact, they were better than the Sufis, the Sufi method. But what the Sufis were doing, so long as they avoided certain kinds of heresies, they were perfectly legitimate. And even he was able to forgive their shatahat. Some of them would go and say, I am God. He would say that if their excuse was that they have lost their mind, you left them alone. Right? So he wasn't at all like some of the present day Wahhabis, and I'm not going to oppose or uphold any of these doctrines, but he would neither agree with today's Wahhabis nor with the Sufis. Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, his student, who was again a master jurist and a scholar and a theologian and himself a very pious scholar, wrote a book on Madarij al-Salikin, if you will, which is a summary of the first 6 centuries of spiritual sciences, Sufis and non-Sufis. So it's a summary, if you will. He tried to put Ibn Taymiyyah's project in one book by saying, look, what is good about Sufis and what's good about other ways of seeking spirituality. Okay? Imam al-Shatibi, again, so this is a very fertile era. You have just great scholars who are looking at the first 7 centuries of Islam and writing great books. And one of them is Imam al-Shatibi. In his book Al-Muwafaqat, he tries to bring various schools of Islamic law and various differing sub-schools together by establishing the basic principles of jurisprudence or maqasid al-sharia. And he establishes each of the maqsad, each of the objectives of sharia based on the Quran, based on a very sophisticated method of what we may in English call induction or istiqra, by looking at many, many, many verses of the Quran to say that some objectives of sharia, of Islamic law, appear to be evident in all of these hundreds and hundreds of rulings, and therefore this is one of the objectives of sharia. So it's a very sophisticated method, which again is taken up by many other scholars after him. Ibn Khaldun, another North African, Imam Shatibi is North African. Ibn Khaldun, another North African scholar, who looks at things from a very different perspective. He is another scholar in some ways. He does in empirical and historical sciences what Ibn Taymiyyah does in theological and legal sciences. What Ibn Khaldun does is Ibn Khaldun says that the ways of looking at history are all influenced by Greek and Hellenistic sciences, and what we really need to go back to the data. And so he rejects philosophical approach and starts an empirical look at what history teaches us. And he has been called by many as the father of sociology and the father of, if you will, political sociology, how societies how communities and politics work. Again, you have some very, very interesting, brilliant scholars at this time. The 9th century, a new phenomenon begins, which is the beginning of the end of the period that we are talking about in some ways, and the beginning of the Ottoman period. These periods are this period, the 9th or the 15th century, is a period when the whole of Islamic world, which was for the last 800 years, was ruled by provincial rulers in different parts of the world. It now comes to be ruled by 3 major empires. So this is another era of empire building. Why do big empires emerge at this time? Well, historians say that the rise of gunpowder and guns as a successful military technique and weapon allows large armies to be created without lifelong training. Whereas before, military technology was based on horse warriors, people who sat and fought on horses. In order to do that, you needed to spend all your life on the horseback. It was very difficult to create an army of horse warriors. So and don't ask me why, but it was much easier to create armies of people with guns. Anyway, so for one reason or another, the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Safavids emerged as 3 great empires. The Mughals in India, Safavids in Iran, and Ottomans in what is present-day Middle East and North Africa and Eastern Europe.
Dr. Anjum?
Yes.
So the term, because maybe some people might differ with you, I don't know if this is from your research, or because this is the first time I hear gunpowder.
Well, they're just, Western historians call them gunpowder empires.
The Westerns. Okay.
Western historians.
Not us. I mean, yeah, okay.
This is just a way to describe a social military phenomenon.
Okay.
Right?
Because I know some Turks might be offended, so.
Okay, another thing that's happening in these centuries, and I know I'm going to jump and talk about a lot of things right now, that with these new empires, and remember, a lot of people, we said, are converted to Islam at this time. A lot of new people are coming to Islam, and along with them, their old practices are coming into Islam. So some very interesting things are happening. One of them is that the Mughal Emperor Akbar, himself a sort of an illiterate philosopher, who rules over Muslims in India, but Muslims are a minority, 10 to 20%. Or 80% Hindus, of course, that are subjects. So he is influenced by Hindu scholars and Hinduism and many of the Sufi and Neoplatonic ideas. Neoplatonic is just a philosophy that had been popular in the Near East for some time. He says that he's going to mix up Islam and Hinduism and come up with a new religion. He calls it Deen Ilahi. All right. So he invented some practices, some worship, some acts of worship, and he wanted to unite Hindus and Muslims. But he was also an extremely successful emperor who was kind of like the Al-Ma'mun of his time. Extremely successful, extremely rich. But what happens after him is that Indian Muslims, if you will, get a shock, and Ahmad Sirhandi, who is a Sufi, a sheikh, who is persecuted by Akbar and others, he starts a movement, a Sufi tariqa, that is bent on bringing Sufism back to the Sharia, back to Sunnah. Okay? And it is directed against the kind of syncretism or mixing and matching that had become common in this age, especially as you will see in the, Akbar who created Din Ilahi, he was a symptom of the age. Like people were creating all kinds of new, if you will, philosophies. So Ahmad Sirhandi was one of the first signs, if you will, of this new revivalist movements. And Indian Muslims call him the revival of the millennium, because Indians always have to one-up everybody else, right? So you don't have like just a revivalist of the century, he was a revivalist of a millennium, 10 centuries, right? And so, but another also, what is true is that because of this movement, and by the way, he was an initiate in the Naqshbandi tariqa. So he influenced the Naqshbandi tariqa and brought it close to the Sunnah. So in a way, you find the relationship between Sufism and Hadith at this time is very interesting. It's these Sufis who are going back and reviving the sciences of Hadith, or going back to the Sunnah and criticizing the practices of Sufism themselves. In this century, alright, so center of Hadith scholarship also gradually moves to India. That is, there are many, many scholars of Hadith who begin to focus on Hadith sciences in India, and the center moves from, say, Baghdad and Cairo and Damascus or Hijaz to India. Of course, the year 1492, extremely important because it's the year when Europeans discovered America, and also the year when the Muslims were kicked out of Spain in the final year. Another very interesting thing, as I said earlier, the Safavids in Iran, Safavids are a Sufi tariqa, that is a Sunni Sufi tariqa, that comes to power in Iran and then becomes 12er Shia and converts the inhabitants of Iran that are mostly Sunni to 12er Shi'ism. Why that happens is a very interesting chapter in Islamic history. But really, the Safavids are Sunni Sufis who have some extremist ideas. Their followers are mostly radical radical Shia who believe that the Safavid ruler, Safavid Sheikh, is divine, is God, right? So they die and kill like nobody else. But once they come to power, the Abbasids or Safavids are scared of these guys, so they sort of kill them off and set them aside and bring in a moderate version of Shi'ism. The reason they don't want to bring in Sunnism to Iran, or they don't want to adopt Sunnism, is because the Ottomans now have the Khilafah, and the Ottomans are Sunni, if you will, and they're claiming the Khilafah. So the question was maybe, and this is one of the explanations, that maybe they force converted everybody because if their followers were Sunni, their loyalties might belong to the Ottoman Khalifa, right? So they said, okay, let's force convert them all. Okay, so I'm going to move all the way to the 18th century, that is 18th century of Common Era, 2 centuries ago. This is before the British take over India, and this is before, so this is, if you will, the last snapshot of the Muslim world before colonization hit. This is what was happening. Okay? Shah Waliullah, great scholar of the 18th century, who is a great scholar of Hadith and a great scholar of Sufism and of Falsafa, and he's trying to bring all of these sciences together. He also has some very sophisticated understanding, sophisticated vision of social and political life. And he writes a very important book, Hujjatullah al-Baligha, which is a sort of Ihya Ulum ad-Din written in Persian by an Indian scholar. So now Shah Waliullah is trying to purify Sufism, but unlike Ahmad Sirhandi, his sheikh or the earlier who went in a Sunnah direction, Shah Waliullah is far more synthetic thinker. He's a master of hadith, but he also doesn't want to give up falsafa. So he gets some very interesting. But my point is simply to show that scholarship wasn't really disappearing in the Muslim world. You had some great and brilliant minds. They were doing all kinds of things, but there was some kind. If there was some kind of decline, it's not easy to point out that there was this one domain in which Muslims totally went down. There were scholars, there were problems, just like there have been problems before. All right. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, another major figure of the 18th century, who was a scholar of hadith, Hanbali, from north or from central Arabia. Some of his teachers, the main teachers of Ahmad ibn al-Wahhab were interestingly Indian. So in a way, he was learning from the students of Ahmad Sirhandi, right? So some of the major scholars, especially Muhammad Hayat al-Sindhi, was Indian scholar. And what was going on in Hijaz, in Medina at this time, there was a revival of hadith sciences in Medina, influenced by scholars from India and from Morocco and from elsewhere. And I want to give you a sense of how connected the Muslim world is, right? So you have these scholars from all over the world. Some of the students of Sirhandi, Sheikh Sirhandi, that we talked about earlier, go to Yemen and revive the sciences of Islam or of Hadith in Yemen. Some of them go to Arabia in Hijaz. So they're all over the place, and then scholars are coming. So this is a very networked society. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. So there are many movements against problems within Muslims in this at this time. Many different movements, but the only one movement that completely rejects Sufism is the movement of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. So many Sufi movements recognize that there is a problem. The problem of mixing and matching, the problem of people going to graves and practically or actually worshipping graves, the problem of people believing in all kinds of things that have no basis in the Quran and the Sunnah, or the problem of people making claims about being God or being next to God or being one with God and so on and so forth. But so it is Sufi movements themselves, such as the Naqshbandiyya and many others, or Sanusiya in North Africa. They are addressing these problems by returning to the Sunnah and by reviving the sciences of Hadith. Okay, but Muhammad Abdul Wahhab rejects Sufism and other bid'ah and other things completely, and proposes a version of Islam that is rather simple, radically pure, radically Puritan. Let's go back to the Quran and Hadith and throw out everything else. Okay? And this was the time when you had the East India Company take over India, that is through first by trade and then administration. And the Ottomans are getting weaker as Europeans are penetrating. So this is the time, the 12th century of Hijrah or 18th century, when European colonialism begins to make inroad into the Muslim world everywhere. All right, so we're going to take a break now, inshallah.